It's a real pleasure and an honor to be back at St. Norbert and in De Pere, a place which I view with real affection. And I'm thankful for the invitation from Emily, and I'm delighted to share some reflections with you this afternoon on the four pillars of Norbertine life and spirituality, and how they can, and I might venture to say should, relate to how community life is understood at a Norbertine college. First of all, just to have a little definition of the Catholic intellectual tradition, which I believe I wrote a few years ago when I was here. The ongoing process in which Catholic thinkers, employing the full and ever-expanding range of human experience, learning, and creativity, continuously seek to understand, reflect upon, and respond to the implications and meaning for life in the Church and the world of doctrines revealed by God through the sacred scriptures and expressed and handed down in church teachings. And it should be of fundamental importance to a Norbertine college to have people involved in every discipline doing this in their own way. When we come to the Norbertine spirituality itself, we become accustomed to talk about what we sometimes call the four pillars. And they're all four Latin words, and that's not just to seem old, but it's often because the Latin word in many ways is much richer than the English derivative. So it's important to keep sight on that, I think. The first one is, and I'm just going to go through these rather briefly and then integrate them for the rest of the talk, is communio. This idea flows from the theological understanding that God is a Trinity and in a sense is a relational reality marked by unconditional love. Relationship is at the heart of the nature of God in unfathomable ways, and we are called to live in ways that reflect the image of God in which we are told we were created. Contemplatio, Norbertines are called to lead a spiritual life. Through consideration of Scripture and the divine office, the relationship between God and humanity is repeatedly brought before our eyes. The celebration of the Eucharist is a central point in everyday life, where the risen Christ is encountered as the center of the community. Likewise, the Lord can be found in personal prayer and meditation, leading to a longing, a desire for God, as perceived in all things and in each other. Actio. Christian contemplation calls for active engagement in good and fruitful service to the wider community. Norbertines have always engaged in a wide variety of pastoral, cultural, and educational activities. And the nature of this work, as we'll see, is based on the needs of the particular community as discerned over time. And we'll be talking about that as we go along. And then stabilitas laci. On the day of profession, a Norbertine offers and gives himself in a lifetime commitment to a specific church and Norbertine community. Related to this is the idea of localitas, which refers to the commitment a Norbertine community as a whole has over many generations to serve the particular needs of the local community. These four pillars are not really meant to be separated. You don't go from one to the other as if you're walking up steps. They're all interrelated. Today I want to talk about how this is the case. And to do this, I'd like to go back, because I am a medievalist after all, and see how they are interwoven in the roots of Norbertine spirituality, the Augustinian community of charity, the task of teaching by word and example, and the implications of all this for a community based on these ideals. After this, I will present a few thoughts on localitas, hospitality, and communio, and finally the example of St. Norbert as peacemaker. So to begin, I would like to suggest some ideas to you today about how one can think about and express how one is engaged with aspects of the Norbertine heritage, and how one can talk about how you use your particular gifts and talents to do this. It may not be immediately obvious how the lifestyle of a religious order with specific theological principles as foundation stones can be applied as a contemporary college professor or an administrator or the various staff positions many of you hold, or for students. But I think upon some reflection, there are many aspects of the Norbertine heritage which can be considered and applied very fruitfully in an academic context. And that's really what we're here to talk about. The first thing I'd like to mention is how the Norbertine tradition, a central part of the ethos as canons regular, sees fruitful action, such as teaching or any other ministry or activity one can think of, including community service in the widest sense, as being rooted in contemplation. One of the purposes of a Norbertine community and their way of life is to provide the environment for this to take place by creating moments during the day as a built-in part of lifestyle, sometimes as part of praying the liturgy in common, sometimes in private, for one to have the time to think, study, reflect over material, marvel at it and wonder, and then nourished by this contemplation to move into whatever activity you are called upon to perform. I think this is very applicable to an academic environment. It could be thought about in the twofold aspect of how one incorporates this into one's own lifestyle and also how one teaches students the importance of doing this. How one finds a balance between work, putting time into relationships, creating space for contemplation and healthy leisure is very important. And the Norbertine tradition is very encouraging in the search for this balance. Here can be brought up how one views the opportunities to build this into the week. I recall when I was here, there was something called the Sacred Hour on Wednesdays, which some people found very helpful and fruitful as a time in the middle of the week, literally, to stop whatever they would normally be doing and maybe not do anything at all, but practice some sort of quiet and contemplation. But you can imagine hundreds of other things like this. It doesn't have to be a Wednesday morning sacred hour. It could be anything like this that helps basically integrate a contemplative aspect into the work week. Of course, when we want to do these things, and here is the clincher, if we want others to value this, we have to model it for ourselves and not just talk about doing so. So we have to take the structure of things seriously if we actually want things like this to happen. Norbertines see community as intentional. That is to say, people come together for a reason. They come together in a community for a reason. And in fact, the Norbertine theological concept of communio points out the fact that it is an essential and even sacred purpose which animates our association with one another. Communio in the Norbertine tradition is the context in which we as individuals live out a fully human life. A life lived out not just in a humanitarian or socially sensitive way, which is really, really important in its own way, but even going a bit deeper than that, in a manner that points out the spiritual and even more strongly divine perspective on our human relationships and activities. This is a very rich concept. It's not something that is just easily grasped or dismissed, because it really enjoins us to think about how we approach everything, how we approach our community relationships and responsibilities, including those as teachers, as scholars within our chosen professional fields, and all of the other leadership roles we embrace on campus. And most people embrace more than one, from freshmen all the way across the board. Okay, so now we're going to go a little bit back in time to give some historic depth, maybe, to what I've been saying. Here we have a nice medieval picture of St. Augustine giving St. Norbert his rule. We can see this Norbertine view of communio enunciated in many ways, including the ancient rule of St. Augustine, which is the basis of Norbertine life. This rule, as lived out by Norbert in the 12th century, and the 12th century motto of the Canons Regular, docere verbo et exemplo, to teach by word and example, which is, of course, the motto of our college. So let's start with the rule of St. Augustine a little bit. The rule of St. Augustine, in a famous phrase, expresses communio as a community moving in one mind and one heart on the way to God, where ultimately we approach God and one another not in a spirit of fear and mistrust, but rather in a spirit of charity and love. This journey, which the canons are on together, is nourished by common prayer and a common life. It's marked by attentiveness, which I think is a very important word for this talk today, marked by attentiveness to one another, and indeed a spirit of mutual guidance toward these common goals. In this context, the rule of St. Augustine, which by the way is a 5th century document, it has a very troubled and complicated textual history, but it's just called the rule of St. Augustine, and that'll be good enough for us. As well as the personal example of St. Norbert, sees leadership as marked or characterized by attentiveness, by sincerity, and by fairness. Following Norbert, a leader should be forthright and exercise authority, but to do so primarily as an agent of peace and reconciliation, both on the intimate level between individuals who are having a problem, and on the wider, what we might say, macro level of problem solving, more generally. A leader in this tradition should also be one who genuinely embodies in herself or himself a spirit of radical hospitality, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. These values of the Norbertines, I think, can be integrated into behavior in the classroom or in any activity or meeting involving students, and how one creates a room that is hospitable to students in terms of sensitivity to diversity of every kind, opportunities for expression of opinion, and also the avoidance of attitudes and presuppositions which by their nature create an uncomfortable and unwelcoming situation. These attitudes can also be extended into the area of collegiality as well. Leadership informed by the Norbertine ethos should be engaged in the process of helping community members, including students, maximize their unique individual gifts and strengths to contribute to the health and effectiveness of the whole community. To this end, in its articulation of what communio means, and very significantly what attitude it should engender, the rule of St. Augustine contains one of the first and still most articulate expressions of the Catholic ideal of the common good, which is completely central, really, to Catholic social teaching. And here's what the rule says about this. In this way, no one shall perform any task for his own benefit, but all your work shall be done for the common good, with greater zeal and more dispatch than if each one of you were to work for yourself alone. It's very interesting. For charity, as it is written, is not self-seeking, meaning that it places the common good before its own, not its own before the common good. So whenever you show greater concern for the common good than for your own, you may know that you are growing in charity. Thus, let the abiding virtue of charity prevail in all things that minister to the fleeting necessities of life. So working for the common good and teaching students to do so on campus and in the world is one very important way to support this aspect of St. Norbert's mission, its Norbertine mission. Support for service and service learning, for instance, can be seen in this Norbertine context. The Norbertine tradition argues and indeed requires a view of community in which everyone is taken seriously and that everyone really and truly has something worthwhile and even crucial to contribute to the project of communio. In using the very strong language and image that every single person is a temple of the Holy Spirit, the rule adopts the biblical Pauline language in a way that should really stop us in our tracks. We get way too used to some of these things and just say, oh yes, a person should be a temple of the Holy Spirit, and what's the next sentence? Things like that should really make us pause and think about, what if we actually treated everybody that way? But that's what it's calling people to do. It makes us think about the implications for how we treat each other on our campus. Some further practical applications of this are embodied in the college motto, which we're going to talk about now, which I also think can be helpful in discerning what it means to live out the mission of the college in our professional interactions. The first Norbertine canons in the 12th century elaborated on what their rule taught about the implications of communio by using the phrase, our college motto, to teach by word and example, in different contexts and repeatedly as the way to express their particular view of the religious life. Central to their view of community life was the concept of edification. Sometimes that word edification doesn't have such a strong meaning in English, but it's from a Latin word which means to build up, and that's really what it's about. In this case, to strengthen or build up one's neighbor, whether by tending to their physical, their spiritual, or their emotional needs. The canons in the 12th century emphasize that every member of the community, from the abbot down to the newest novice, or the lay brothers, is both a teacher and a learner. There is a sense articulated among the canons that every member of the community, not just the abbot or the senior priests, but everyone, is called upon to edify or build up their fellows by both what he says and what he does. There is an important emphasis on effective speech and the link between conduct and speech in the process of edifying our neighbors and fellow community members. It is important for making applications to our own campus situation to realize that the canons did not mean to apply this only or even primarily to official figures, such as the abbot. They certainly did include the abbot in these. It's not that they didn't, but the concern goes far beyond this, and is much more interesting, really, than that, and goes much deeper. Instead, it is really meant to refer to all interactions between the brothers, the day-to-day life together, the hundreds of moments, most of which are quite ordinary and undramatic, which make up life together in any community. The canons saw every community member as called upon in every situation to both instruct and be instructed. So to both instruct and be instructed by what we do and what we say. They call for their fellow canons, and this is crucial, I think, to cultivate an awareness of the effects of our own words and deeds on one another. This will lead to the formation of a very specific type of community within the abbey, and then the idea would be that the canons will carry this same awareness to the laity and others they encounter outside the abbey walls. This injunction to teach or instruct by word and example was meant to refer to every aspect of community life. It was meant to create a climate of individual responsibility understood in a community context. Thoughtless words and selfish acts were not just bad because God was watching and would punish you and hold you responsible, although I'm sure they certainly believe that. But that wasn't the only reason to be nice. Okay? But rather because they actually hurt and offended or misled another member of the community and hindered his or her development. And it is not just an avoidance of doing bad and hurtful things, which is at the heart of this teaching. Rather, it is having a serious and conscious awareness of the positive value of our good and uplifting words and actions on those around us. And in the writings of the early canons, they stress that this awareness is important to have in every situation. Every time we interact with members of the community, there is the opportunity for edification. To put it in language often used today, every personal interaction is a teaching moment, a chance for us to build one another up in ways that benefit everyone. And we are lifelong learners, as we say nowadays, and teachers at the same time. Whereas the monks in Norbert's time emphasized that one must shun bad behavior in order not to offend God and give scandal to our neighbor, the canons urged how one must bring your neighbor to do good by your words and examples. The canons took the idea of being a light to others beyond the personal virtue talked about by the monks at that time and gave it a profoundly social context. Christians are not just called to be lights of the world in the abstract. It's a wonderful thing to say and to sing about, let's be lights of the world, but actually to other people, actually to one another, in the everyday, often undramatic moments of life, whether it's surrounded by the people whom we see all the time and who know us all well and whom we tend to take for granted. Okay? This early Norbertine view of communio can transform the workplace and the attitudes we bring to our tasks and relationships within it. Everyone must believe their input is welcome and valued and are called upon to contribute, but also to be open to the contributions of others. Everyone is called upon to teach, but also called upon to be open to instruction, including and perhaps most especially from the most unlikely quarters. One can ask, I think, and I hope you will, after hearing this maybe, I know I try to, how can I actually do this? How can I actually do this? And how can I actually cultivate this awareness as an ideal for my students and coworkers and colleagues? That should be the question in this tradition that we're asking ourselves. Thus, the motto, the rule of St. Augustine, give us some insights into how the Norbertine tradition interprets communio. It raises human relationships to a sacred level. I would suggest that when thinking about how a person could integrate these values and attitudes into work on campus, there are many examples of how one could think and talk about this. For example, this could mark our committee meetings, our office hours, our student advising sessions, our comportment in and out of the classroom, our relations with teammates in athletics, and that most intense form of all, in the dormitories. It can include the teaching and presentation methods we employ in the classroom, mediating conflicts which arise, interactions with staff in the dining halls and in the library, our attitudes toward coworkers, including those engaged in seemingly the most humble tasks, whom we meet throughout the course of any given day. The Norbertine tradition of communio calls upon us to listen to people, to discern their real needs, to learn from one another, contemplate what we have learned and heard, and then, and only then, act upon in ways that create a culture of edification and encouragement. Let's talk a little bit now about stabilitas of loci and how it manifests itself in something called localitas. Some of you may recognize this very early picture of life at the college. The hint is, it was a long time ago. Okay, that's the reason behind that picture. What does the word locality mean? Like most interesting words, it comes from a Latin word, localitas. But what is a locality? Well, it's a place, it's a district. For instance, the sentence, they moved to another locality. Okay, that's one meaning for it. But like most Latin nouns of this type, it has a more abstract meaning as well. That's more relevant for us, I think, in some ways. The state or fact of being local or having a location. The locality that every object has. This definition has some potential to explore. As a spirituality, commitment to serving in a place as part of a permanent community. We cannot be Christians in the abstract. We can only interact with real people who are actually present to us. All Christians say they believe this, so how is the Norbertine charism different, or how does it deepen this? The way it does so we can express through the term localitas, which is an outgrowth of the Norbertine vow or practice of stability of place. In other words, a permanent commitment to a community. Norbertines, since the 12th century, take a vow to serve a particular church or abbey, not a province or even the order in general, which is very different than the friars or the Jesuits or most modern orders. The idea is to actually make Christ present in a particular place, and not just for one moment or one day or when you're in a good mood or having a good day, but day after day over time. How do you do that? Well, the way that has been done for a long time is by establishing a community where each member is committed to the other, first and foremost, where they strive to help one another, and they mutually guide one another to teach and learn from one another, to teach by word and example. Needless to say, we actually have to be together and in touch to do that for one another. Norbertines have no one mission in the sense that they are only engaged in a specific activity which defines them. To answer the question, what do Norbertines do? The ultimate answer is whatever needs to be done in a particular place at a particular time. This was true from the beginning of the order. The needs of a medieval community in rural Scotland may have been different than in a German city, although they were all known for the practice of hospitality and care for strangers. But really, there is no one thing Norbertines do, such as care for the sick or teach children. That specificity of function defines many of the modern congregations who were formed to do all sorts of specific things, but not the Norbertines. Instead, what they actually did and do is establish a community in an actual place. They lived there over time, praying the liturgy together and seeing the needs of the people in the community. People come to them and they go out into the local community as well. Here they put into practice important values as part of an ongoing process, not according to a prearranged plan or script. That reflects the relationship between action and contemplation. So what does it involve? It involves attentiveness to reality, discernment, and then suitable action. And that suitable action may change over time because things change. The community discerns how best to assign their financial and, equally importantly, human resources to serve the community of which they themselves are a permanent part. This can mean making very difficult decisions and sometimes taking risks, and is almost never easy, but it is a crucial part of localitas. An early disciple of St. Norbert, named Anselm of Havelborg, described what the Norbertines were hoping to do in a beautiful way. He said that a canon is called to be a light shining in a dark place, something to depend upon for one another, but also for the wider community. What will happen in the temple or church will then radiate out to form community, and then one comes back to the temple or church for renewed strength. That is what happened with Christ and the disciples. That is what St. Augustine practiced. That is what Norbert envisioned for Premontre, and that is what Norbertines have striven to do over the centuries. Becoming part of the very fabric of a place. If you approach one of the great European abbeys that's in the countryside still, from a distance you can literally see the abbey almost growing out of the landscape. Taking the physical environment and aesthetics very seriously. That means building places for prayer and contemplation which people know will be there. Like an abbey, but say Old St. Joe's here on the campus. To reach the point where there is no us and them, to reach the point where one does not minister to people in a place as to an outsider, but an identification of all as one community. The religious community then is the center or focal point which helps nourish and energize ministry. The understanding of the Norbertines' order's way of living out Christianity must include the culture of place, or localitas, that derives ultimately from the vow of stabilitas, the commitment to one particular church and therefore community within which the order aspires to be, according to the parables of the Gospels, as leaven or as a mustard seed. As a former professor here, Wolfgang Grassel, in a book, put it some years ago, the devotion to work at a particular location is at least a partial answer to the question of what the distinctiveness of the Norbertine order is. Throughout their history, the Premonstratensians have built a culture of place in their own communities and in concentric circles around these in the wider society. Local embedding has had a strong impact for the life of the order throughout its history, regardless of which part of the world. It implied a deep commitment to a region and its people, evidenced often through parish ministry, the management of business enterprises, or educational activities. But whatever the particular ministry, it is nourished by the community life of word, sacrament, and fellowship, with individuals committed to stability, with the Eucharist and communal prayer as the fuel which fires localitas. And this is at the heart of the Norbertine virtue of radical hospitality, which is also part of communio. There has to be some medieval side. This was a primary virtue of all medieval monasteries, even going back to the Desert Fathers and Mothers, where we find some of the most beautiful stories of hospitality, through the traditions of the Benedictines and those regular canons like the Norbertines who followed the rule of St. Augustine. The Norbertines from the beginning were known, and this has continued down to modern times, for their special concern and care for the poor. There are numerous examples of this from the life of St. Norbert, who singled out the poor and destitute for help as he divested himself of his enormous personal wealth during his conversion, and his solicitude for the poor continued. As Archbishop of Magdeburg, one of the main reasons Norbert struggled to have lands illegally taken from the diocese to be returned was to fulfill extensive obligations for the care of the poor. Also, while Norbert was archbishop and among his immediate disciples in eastern Germany, there had been an attempt to militarily conquer and forcibly convert a tribe known as the Wends. The crusade created many problems of what we would now call displaced persons and lives disrupted by violence. And we know from the sources that the Norbertines were important in at least hoping to ameliorate this situation. Once the order took on its formal existence and constitutions, we noticed the very important institution known as the Xenodochium. This term literally means house for strangers and is the opposite of xenophobia, which is the fear of strangers. It was a hospice, a place to offer shelter and physical and psychological sustenance for travelers, for pilgrims, the poor, the displaced, the dispossessed. These xenodochia also functioned as hospitals, in many areas often the only ones, as there really were no hospitals in the Middle Ages except those run by religious orders. We also know from some saints' lives very poignantly that the poor were often buried in Norbertine abbeys, a final service of hospitality, one might say. The lives of various saints give powerful witness to this concern as a key element of Norbertine spirituality, and I will just mention a few today. Saint Gilbert, a Frenchman in the 12th century, like many nobles of his day, went off enthusiastically to participate in the Crusades. But upon his return, wearied of a life of violence, he renounced it for life in a religious order. His wife and daughter, Petronilla and Ponzia, followed him into the order, and together, following the example of St. Norbert, they built a hospital attached to the abbey. They became well known for their pastoral care, extended through this hospice, including for children. And I'd like to emphasize they were known not only for physical care, but also what we would today call counseling and psychological care. A feature of the Xenodokia from early on was the prominent role Norbertine women played in this ministry, such as Petronilla and Poncia and Blessed Oda, whose life you can read in that wonderful Classics of Western Spirituality volume, Norbert and Norbertine Spirituality. It's in there. Blessed Gertrude of Altenburg Abbey in Germany could also be mentioned for the important hospitals she built. One last person who I think is particularly relevant is Blessed Bronislava, a Norbertine in Krakow, Poland in the 13th century. Not only did she have a hospice, but she had to deal with the dramatic aftermath of the devastation caused by a Mongol invasion of the area, in which her own sisters and their house was completely destroyed. In these dire straits, in which a plague also broke out, she and her sisters rallied and cared for the displaced, poor, and sick. And one could multiply many stories over the centuries. Sadly, they still seem to be added to. In this spirituality, we have a hearkening back to the earliest apostolic community, and one that sounds very modern and even post-Vatican II, where we move from an attitude of having a ministry to the poor, almost an us and them, to a moment, as in the case of Bronislava, where there was an actual identification with the poor and dispossessed. This idea of radical hospitality can and I think should inform every aspect of college life that says it's in a Norbertine tradition. Just like to say a few things about St. Norbert as peacemaker now, and then a few concluding words. We're all familiar with the Sermon on the Mount, where Christ essentially instructs us on how to live. The tradition of the Church urges us to pay close attention to every line of this sermon, for as St. Augustine puts it, the one who reflects soberly and devoutly will find in this sermon, in respect of all that regards the conduct of our daily life, the perfect manner of Christian living. Today, I just want to focus for a few moments on the one particular verse, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God," and how it relates to St. Norbert of Xanten, our patron, who, as you know, lived in the 12th century and was a great reformer of the clergy and founded the Norbertines. This Norbert came to have a reputation as the great peacemaker of his very, very troubled times. Norbert was born around the year 1080 in Xanten, near the modern German-Dutch border on the west bank of the Rhine. He was an aristocrat of the highest level, with close relationships on both sides of his family to the German and French royal houses. Around the time his father and brother went off to fight in the First Crusade, Norbert, who seemed to have been a pleasant, handsome, fun-loving, and rather spoiled young man, began his own family-destined, predictable path as a cleric, as a clergyman in the German church. And moving through, as a noble was expected to do, he found himself before long in the retinue of the emperor himself. His rather steady but unremarkable careerist trajectory seems to have been disturbed when he accompanied the emperor when, during one phase of the long power struggle with the papacy known as the investiture controversy, the German ruler invaded Italy, took Rome by force, and imprisoned the elderly pope in hope of convincing him to accept, let's just say, the emperor's point of view. Norbert, who was in the emperor's train, we know visited the pope several times in prison. We don't have a record of their conversation, but he seems to have become disillusioned with the whole way things were going in the emperor's service. And when they returned to Germany, he left the imperial retinue and refused promotion in the church. It was time for him to become a bishop and probably archbishop. And he soon underwent a radical conversion and call to a serious religious life. He gradually divested himself of his wealth and began what today we would call vocation discernment, living in turn with hermits and various types of monks and canons before deciding to become a rather radical, poor, wandering preacher. While Norbert had many enemies who distrusted his radical way of life, he also had some powerful friends among the bishops and eventually received papal permission for his way of life. He founded a group of religious communities centered on the new abbey of Premonstratensians in France, who became known as White Canons due to the color of their habits, As the Cistercians under the leadership of St. Bernard reformed the monks, so Norbert, his friend, helped spark the reform of clergy all over Europe. Even St. Bernard, not known to be self-effacing, considered Norbert to be the finest preacher of the age. Eventually, Norbert was made, to his own reluctance and chagrin, Archbishop of Magdeburg on the eastern frontier of Germany, where until his death he supported missions, church reform, and tried to mediate in continuing struggles between the popes and emperors that caused so much distress in those days. In what ways was Norbert a peacemaker? In good medieval fashion, I'll suggest 3 ways, all of which have potential relevance for every Christian in every age, regardless of the differences in who we are and where we live and what we do. First of all, he allowed himself to be guided on the road to inner peace by pursuing surrender, really, to God as he saw it. Through a process of gradual and painstaking discernment, punctuated by dramatic moments, Norbert felt he let Christ take over his life. He gradually came to see that if he became poor in spirit and let God lead him, his former way of life could be left behind, and he could be transformed from the conventional into the extraordinary, something that was genuinely centered on God. And because it was centered on God, he came to see that he needed to love others and to bring to them the peace he had found within. This inner peace, a purity of heart centered upon God and manifested in charity, is something the Beatitudes, of course, direct us toward, something we are called to aspire to. As St. Jerome, a famous contemporary of Augustine, put it, the peacemakers are called blessed who first make peace within their own heart, and then between their dissonant brethren. For what does it profit you to make peace between others while vice is at war within your own heart? And that seems to be what Norbert did. After his conversion and years of prayer and recollection, at peace now with himself and God, the focus of his itinerant preaching became peace in a second sense, the restoration of hope and reconciliation in the villages he visited throughout France, Germany, and the Low Countries. He would enter into a village, and in those days of feudal violence, he often would attempt to reconcile warring and broken families. We are told when the villagers knew he was approaching, they would ring the church bells, and children would run out and escort him into the village. He would often preach and hold meetings with those at odds with one another, and after celebrating the Eucharist with them present, would have them make peace over the relics of the saints. More humbly, but no less significantly, he would counsel and help reconcile the distressed, the ostracized, and those in need of healing for one reason or another, often women who had been marginalized and accused of demonic possession. He also ministered to the powerful, often stricken by their own form of alienation and inner turmoil. One great example was the German nobleman Count Godfrey of Koppenborg. Godfrey had led a troubled life as a warlike nobleman, and in those tumultuous times he had actually burned down the local cathedral. Dejected in remorse and alienation, he eventually joined Norbert, gave over his wealth, and found peace as a simple lay brother, as Norbert's dear spiritual friend and confidant. For all of these activities of Norbert, we are told by Norbert's early biographer that while traveling through France, quote, the next day early in the morning he rose and departed for another village not far away in order to preach to the people. He was very devoutly received here because they had heard he was a bearer of the word of God and a bringer of tranquil peace. Not a bad epitaph. Thirdly, when he was made Archbishop of Magdeburg, essentially a prince archbishop and one of the most powerful advisors in the empire, he was essentially what would later be called chancellor, really, of the empire at some point. Norbert found himself called to be a peacemaker on yet another level, what we might today call the realm of international politics. The intense conflicts between the popes and emperors continued, with all the distress this brought to people at every level of society, and Norbert found himself in the often unenviable position of trying to keep things together, or at least from further deterioration. In this, he was for the most part successful, but like all great peacemakers, it did not make him universally popular. And I think that this is one of the reasons that despite his widely acknowledged sanctity and all of his importance, he would not be formally canonized until over 4 centuries after his death. Peacemakers, as the Sermon on the Mount brings home so powerfully and poignantly, are not always appreciated, however much they are always desperately needed. St. Norbert and his followers tried to live out the Beatitudes as best they could. They knew there was much darkness in their own hearts and in the world around them, and led by a great and inspired teacher, they hoped to bring the light wherever they went. As one early Norbertine put it, they prayed, trained, and worked that they might be lanterns illuminating the shadows wherever they went. Like their master Christ, they were called, as they often put it, to teach by word and example, to let their deeds and teaching go together. I learned from St. Norbert that if we really want to be effective peacemakers on all levels, then we must begin in our own hearts with ourselves. Then, at the same time, then we turn to our families, our own relationships in churches, schools, the workplace, to try to reconcile the alienated, the broken and tender souls and hearts within our own everyday reach. Then, when and if we are called, to discern how to do this in a more public arena, perhaps for a few of us, even on the scale of Norbert. Maybe some people in this room will go on and do that. Perhaps for most of us as engaged citizens. But we will not be effective in bringing peace to others if we do not allow God to bring it into our own hearts first. Now, a final thought. There is a power in wood which has always attracted me, whether the solidity of a door or the polished elegance of an ancient choir stall or pew. Beautiful wood has always drawn me, and I think many of you, into its rich embrace. I first saw the statue of Norbert carved over 200 years ago and based on a still extant 17th century original in a choir stall of a German abbey years ago in the then Todd Ware Library, one of its previous incarnations. It sat there in those days, perched somewhat forlornly, out of place near the reference area, hardly noticed by the busy passers-by, and often getting a little banged up. I always thought it was beautiful, and when the time came and the nascent Center for Norbertine Studies was given a modest space on the second floor of the Todd Ware Library, which I and my amazing colleague Catherine were beginning to decorate, we requested that it be moved there. As plans were realized for the very large and lovely space in the new library, which I hope you know about, we knew from the beginning that this statue would finally have the dwelling place it so richly deserved. With the creative help of facilities and Donald Taylor, who helped us clean, polish, and repaired the more fragile parts, the wooden statue of our patron saint now stands protected but highly visible in a lovely case in the reading room of the CNS in the Mulva Library. There he greets every visitor to the center, who as they walk in gaze upon his calm, serene, and compassionate expression. The patient look of Norbert of Xanten, holding out to them the promise of encountering Christ in the Eucharist and the fellowship and communion of the Church. In his wonderfully expressive countenance, we grasp the sadness that his work as a peacemaker is never done. But also in the Eucharist and the cross he holds, a sign of where the great saint always deeply believed true and lasting peace was to be found. I never have been able to find out the name of the person who carved the statue. I think I've given up trying. Doesn't really matter now. But I am grateful to him and the others who have lovingly cared for it and passed it down to be enjoyed by generations present and still to come in this lovely place. Like the Norbertine heritage itself, born and cultivated in Europe and transplanted to this fertile land, it will continue to provide a continuity with the past and a vision gazing ever forward. When I think of St. Norbert College, I will first and foremost cherish memories of the wonderful friends and colleagues I have known and still know, but I will also think of this lovely statue and how it greeted me morning after morning, beams of sunlight illuminating the gentle nuances of the wood, the monstrance and the Archbishop's cross, held aloft by very delicate hands, with calm gaze, beseeching us to contemplate the need for peace, for communio, and the mysteries of faith. Thank you.